introduce him. So Ravi Iyer, he's the managing director of the Psychology of Technology Institute, which is a project of the University of Southern California's Neely Center. Before that, Ravi led the data science research and the product teams across Facebook with the goal of improving the societal impact of social media. So we have a lot to learn from his talk, which is titled Platform Design as a Lever to Address Misinformation and Hate Across Contexts and in India.
Can everybody hear me? So, hey everybody, thank you for having me here. I know my name is Indian, but I actually grew up here. And I have to admit one thing I love about, like some of the most profound things I've learned in my career, like improving technology's impact on society. I've been talking to people from diverse audiences and learning about all the experiences around the world. So I've just been really enjoying the conference and appreciating the ability to learn from diverse perspectives. And thanks to Joy and everyone for putting this conference together. Really learned a lot. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about platform design and my experiences. I work at Psychology and Technology Institute, which is a project at the University of Southern California Neely Center. I'm a social psychologist by trade. Done a lot of work on polarization, worked with people in the community. About 5 years ago, I was recruited to work at Facebook on polarization. I started off as a data science manager in newsfeed integrity. Data science at Facebook is a little bit like being an accountant. So I had to count, the amount of policy violating content that we had. I would set goals for teams, and the kind of things we would count would be things like, what percentage of things are clickbait, engagement bait, violence incitement, hate speech, misinformation. I quickly realized I didn't really believe in the things we were counting necessarily. Take our violence incitement policies. We've all probably said something like, I'm going to kill you to somebody else, which technically, might violate a policy. Usually it's because they ate our sandwich or they, borrowed our car. We're not actually going to kill that person. And there are all sorts of ways that people actually threaten people around the world where they actually don't violate policies necessarily. They just, some accounts, sending out a picture of a person or using the right hashtag can be very threatening to others. So the policies don't necessarily match to people's, to what we could drive down these counts of policy violating content, and we wouldn't really solve the problem in the world. So I decided to become a research manager where I could talk to I could talk to users and ask them how our policies were mapping to their lived experiences. Worked in civic integrity, I worked on elections, I worked in a lot of international contexts, places like Ethiopia, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, India. And then I eventually realized that if I wanted to have the impact I wanted, I needed to move to the core algorithms. If you're not optimizing for the right things, a lot of the success we were having was actually changing the design of our systems, not in trying to enforce on content afterwards. So I'll talk a little about that experience and some of those lessons learned. So just to further illustrate why I don't think the enforcement model works, I just want to use the example of hate speech. So I'm going to cite some work by Kieran, who's in the audience here, about how fear speech is often more common and more engaged with than hate speech. He has a paper in PNAS about looking at Gab. He's done some work with WhatsApp, just finding that oftentimes a lot of the content that you see that actually is causing harm in communities is not actually hate speech, it's fear speech. And that dovetails well with my experience at a platform and as a psychologist. In the upper left, you can see a meta-analysis of the ways that people use intergroup anxiety to create negative attitudes towards outgroups. And then in these crisis settings that I worked in, you would often see content that was fear speech that was problematic. So, when the George Floyd protests happened in the United States, people would talk about Antifa is coming to your town. And the problem with this kind of content is I can't prove that no member of Antifa is coming to your town as part of these protests. It's probably true that some member of Antifa in some protest went to one town, but it's misleading to suggest that this is a common experience, right? So you don't have to lie to people to mislead them. You don't have to lie to people to create intergroup animosity. And this led to real world consequences. People showed up with guns to protect their communities and the protests, and some people were killed. So similarly, on the right, there's some content from Sri Lanka. The charge here is that there are Muslims in the community that are going to sterilize members of the other community. Again, it's a hard thing to, we know that it's untrue, but it's a hard thing to prove that it's untrue. Right? A lot of these things are hard to actually action from like a policy point of view. And here are just some examples from India that, I worked on the other side of, things like there are people in your community who are threatening your children. I mean, that's honestly, if you watch the 11 o'clock news in the United States, that's a lot of the content. But you can't outlaw people being concerned about threats to their children, even when in some contexts, it'll have very serious consequences. So this is a graph I would sometimes show internally about how content that is dangerous is not usually about the content. It's partially about the content. And this is a graph that the Dangerous Speech Project produced. And they show that, and it's somewhat intuitive. They're like, what makes something dangerous is not the content of the speech, which is often what policies deal with. It's also who's saying it, who they're saying it to, what's the context that the speech is occurring. And, when you think about it that way, it's unsurprising that, content level enforcement doesn't really work at scale because it often just deals with that one piece of the pie, just that message. When in reality, there's all these other factors that, we're trying to get people to, that we need to understand if something's dangerous. And these are decisions often being made by, poorly paid contractors in some setting. And then we train AI systems on top of that, right? So you're sort of compounding the error. The policy doesn't map to the harm. There are people making judgments of the policy who are, not necessarily given the time to make all these judgments. And then there are AI systems which have their own error being trained on top of it. And when you lean into this, you get things like over enforcement and censorship. So, in places, even if the policies were perfect, even if policies were perfectly enforced, there's still places where you wouldn't really want, it would actually be normative to have attitudes towards the other side. So whether you're in Palestine, whether you're in Israel, whether you're in Ukraine, you could say some 20-minute, really heartfelt story about your experience in those areas. And then maybe we would take down your content because, at the end you say something like, oh, and we should defend ourselves against those Russians who are X, Y, or Z. Like it doesn't really map to our norms and it doesn't map to the harm in the world sometimes if we lean into enforcement. So, so a lot of what I wanted to say is this, that enforcement doesn't work, but design does. And that's the kind of thing that we worked on to address these situations. And I'll tell you a few stories about some specific design changes that we made that did work. And most of these are all public. So these are things you can read about in various articles. There's actually a Wall Street Journal article about a BuzzFeed where Jonah Peretti came to us and said he's not proud of the content that we're incentivizing. And I'd love for you to just think to yourself, if you think about what does well on social media and your incentives, is social media pushing you to push out content that's better that you're proud of, or is it pushing you to push out content that you are not proud of that you feel is worse, right? And a lot of that is based on the incentives that social media companies produce. And to Facebook's credit, it's done a lot of work to try and understand how we can try to remove some of those incentives. Now, I don't think it's gone far enough, but at least we have some idea about the kinds of things that work that can improve the incentives in the ecosystem. And one of them is just removing these engagement incentives. One way you can think about it is like health food versus junk food. I can put donuts in front of you and you might engage with them, but it's not something you actually want to engage with, right? And so like, there are lots of things you will engage with, but you don't actually want. I will engage with fight videos. I will engage with profanity, sexually suggestive content. These are all things that I might, stop my feed and look at. I might even comment on, but it's not something that has value to me. So some of the things that have worked have been changing our algorithms to remove some of these engagement incentives, reforming the meaningful social interaction metric away from things like anger reactions towards things like love reactions that are more indicative of user value. For political content, removing the incentive to get comments and shares, because a lot of times people comment on things because it's divisive, not because it's something that's actually like a positive thing. And so by removing comments and shares from the incentives, you reduce hate speech, you reduce misinformation, you reduce bullying. You actually lose some amount of time spent, but it was deemed worth it because it reduces some of those bad experiences for you. In its place, you can ask people like, what is the healthier food that they aspire to, right? You can actually ask people, what is content that they like? One of these is a survey that we did in the comment space. Is this comment high or low quality? People don't read more than the first 5 or 10 comments anyway in a thread, right? So if you actually get much further by trying to find the highest quality comments and putting them at the top of your thread, than you do trying to figure out, like, is there hate speech or misinformation in comment number 300, which nobody's really going to read them. So trying to find the good comments is actually a really good lever for trying to actually displace views of these harms. You can also add UI elements that improve the user experience. So there's we now ask, whether users want to see more or see less of certain kinds of content. Again, trying to get at the difference between what you engage with and what you explicitly want. We put a little X in the upper right of many posts to let people say, I'm engaging with this, but I actually don't like it. I want to hide that piece of content. And that's a problem with algorithms in general online. A lot of times they have this positive feedback, but they don't have any negative feedback. I was really heartened yesterday. I took part in a workshop with some others here about how we could reform platforms. And one thing that we landed on was there are these forces that exist in real life that don't exist on social media and online. And how can we introduce those forces? And one important force that exists in real life is just negative feedback. There's some things I could do here, and they would be, if I started saying crazy things, you guys would let me know that was really uncomfortable. You would invite me back. I would get all sorts of negative feedback. The police would not come and take me away. It's not an enforcement thing. It's the social pressure of negative feedback and the reputational hit that I would take that stops me from doing these negative things. How can we introduce those kinds of forces online? And things like adding small UI elements that allow people to give each other negative feedback is some part of this. And then the other thing that worked was rate and functionality limiting. So, in everyday society, we don't put a microphone in Times Square and let any teenager, if they want to, say anything they want to, right? That would be considered dangerous. It's similarly dangerous to let new users go to a comment thread of some really popular piece of content and be the top comment, right? You're sort of giving a microphone to an untrusted person. And so there are lots of ways that you can add rate limits and functionality limitation that can make your space safer. Things like making people have easy ways to make themselves private. It's something that's available in India. It's not necessarily available everywhere in the world. We should just make those kinds of easy privacy protections easier for everyone. Things like group invitations. There's a small, for the January 6th, Stop the Steal groups in the United States. A tiny percentage of users were responsible for inviting lots of people to these groups, just creating some sorts of limitations. Most people don't need to invite tons of people to a group. Having just reasonable limitations to the functionality of these systems can make them a lot safer. So, I have 3 policy recommendations I wanted to leave you guys with. And the first one is really that we should regulate design and not speech. And so the analogy I sometimes use, and this is sort of borrowing from some of my colleagues at Center for Humane Tech and other places, is that, we don't hold people who build buildings responsible if a building goes up in flames, right? Or if bad things happen in that building. We hold them responsible if they design a building that is flammable, right? So social media companies, didn't create all the problems that we see in the world, but insofar as they design systems that amplify those problems, that create, make those problems worse, yeah, we should hold them responsible. So, and I think it's really important, especially, thinking about India, that, that we regulate design, not speech, because when you start to regulate speech, that same paradigm can be used against it, right? So like you say, like, this is the kind of speech that I don't like. And then the government says, well, okay, you're regulating speech. Well, here's the kind of speech that we don't like, right? So, so regulating design, in my estimation, is both more effective, and it doesn't have that backfire effect when, like, an authoritarian government tries to use that paradigm against you. If we're going to regulate design, we need algorithmic transparency. So a lot of the things I've shown you, I feel confident about because a lot of these A/B tests and experiments at platforms have been made public. And so we have that data that some of these things work, right? Engagement, deprecation in favor of actually asking users what they want works because we have the experimental results of those tests. We need the experimental results for many more tests to understand all the changes that platforms do, understanding, like, what are the right design codes that we want social media to have so that it's not incentivizing inflammatory content, misinformation. And then finally, how do we understand if we're making progress? A lot of the work that we've done, that I've seen done well, has centered around not just removing hate speech or some definition of bad, but removing people's bad experiences. And the thing about removing bad experiences, it's naturally, locally sensitive, right? It's people's subjective experiences according to them. And so, you see people argue online about, has Twitter gotten better or worse with Elon Musk, right? And they'll say, well, my feed's gotten better. And somebody say, well, no, my feed's gotten worse, right? There's a more systematic way to do this. You can survey a representative sample of the population, understand if their experiences are getting better or worse. And you can actually understand, is Elon Musk making Twitter better or worse? So we're doing something like that at USC's Neely Center. We're asking people two positive and two negative experiences. We don't want to just remove all the bad things. We also want to amplify the good things. And so we ask people, where are they experiencing things that negatively affect them personally? Are they seeing content they believe is bad for the world? Are they getting a meaningful connection with others? And then are they learning new things? And I'll show you some of the pilot data just to understand how this can work. Again, this is just pilot data. It's not a representative sample yet. But you can see, and you probably can't read this, but just some of the high bars are people are experiencing meaningful connections with people on WhatsApp, on FaceTime, on text messaging. So messaging platforms where people are connecting. They're learning new things on places like YouTube and Reddit, and they're having bad experiences on places like Twitter and not learning, right? So just you get some sort of face valid ways that you can understand people's experiences. And again, these are ways that scale a little bit better in international context. So those are my 3 policy suggestions. And I actually have questions for you, although I'm happy to take your questions as well, which I'd love to, but just, really, so, again, these are the things I'm very much informed by experiences like BuzzFeed coming to us and saying look, our incentives are not great. Political parties in Europe, our incentives are not great. How do people in India feel about, publishers in India feel about the incentives that social media companies are setting? Because I think that is social media companies' responsibility. It's not to remove every bad experience, but to set incentives so that better experiences are incentivized and not worse. And then the second is the idea of regulating design rather than speech. I just think that's a much more productive paradigm that gets us out of these wars about, who's okay to be hateful against and who is not. And so I'd love just more feedback on that. So there's my email address. And yeah, happy to take a question.
Ravi,